Every woman in Montreal's underworld had tried to get close to Hugo Szarka. Not one had lasted past a single evening. He was known in certain circles, the kind that didn't appear in telephone directories or police briefings, as a man whose interest in women began and ended with practical necessity. He kept no mistresses, collected no loyal confidantes, and attended charitable galas only when the property development contracts that funded them were his. At 38, Hugo Szarka controlled a substantial portion of Montreal's construction sector, 3 underground poker establishments from the Plateau to Verdun, and a supply chain that federal investigators had been quietly circling for 7 years without ever getting close enough to bite. He had grey eyes the color of February ice on the St. Lawrence, and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the limestone he built his buildings from. Women noticed. They always noticed. None of them kept his attention past the first glass of wine. That changed on a Tuesday night in January when an exhausted hotel housekeeper found his grandfather's military medal face down in a snowbank behind the Hotel Chateauneuf. The private dining room at Maison Renoir had been closed to the public that Tuesday. Hugo had arranged it that way months in advance, the way he arranged everything, efficiently and without fanfare. He sat at the head of a mahogany table set for 8, his lieutenants arranged around him, conversation moving through shipping logistics and zoning appeal deadlines, and the controlled, bloodless language of organized money. Midway through the main course, the door opened. Katja Boudreau didn't wait to be announced. She never did. The daughter of Fernand Boudreau, who ran protection along the waterfront from Pointe Saint-Charles down to the refineries, swept into the room wearing a dress that cost more than most people earned in a month. And she settled herself into the empty chair at Hugo's right, as though she had been invited. "Mon beau," she said, reaching for the wine glass that had been intended for no one. "My father believes it's time to formalize things. The Boudreau operation and the Szarka name working together. Imagine what we could build." Hugo looked at her the way he looked at an invoice that didn't add up, flatly, without interest. "Your father sends a message through his daughter," Hugo said, setting down his fork. "That tells me 2 things. He thinks charm will work where business hasn't, and he's not confident enough to deliver the message himself." He reached across and lifted the wine glass gently from her hand. "Tell Fernand I respect what he's built on the waterfront. Tell yourself that I am not a contract to be signed." Katja's expression curdled. She stood, smoothed her dress, and left with the particular dignity of someone who had been rehearsing that exit for the entire drive over. The room waited for Hugo to say something cutting. He didn't. He simply gestured for the next course to be brought in. 20 minutes later, he stepped into the back alley behind Maison Renoir to reach the waiting car. The alley was narrow, the January cold immediate and bone-deep, cobblestones slicked with a thin sheet of ice beneath the snow. 4 men came out of the dark between the dumpsters. What followed was brief and ugly. Hugo had not reached his position by delegating violence he wasn't prepared to perform himself. He disarmed the first man before the second had fully raised his weapon. His underboss, Ballant, came around from the car with a speed that belied his size. The last 2 men scattered into the side streets, footsteps fading into the white January silence. Hugo stood in the alley, breathing hard, blood from a split knuckle mixing with the slush at his feet. Ballant was already on his phone calling in the cleanup. It wasn't until they were in the car, crossing the Pont Jacques Cartier toward the safe house, that Hugo reached inside his collar. His hand found nothing. The chain was gone. He made Ballant turn the car around without explanation. They went back. They searched the alley with flashlights for 40 minutes, turning over every piece of garbage, every inch of frozen slush. Nothing. The medal, a Hungarian Royal Army Cross from 1944 that had belonged to his grandfather Bela, who had survived a war, a revolution, and an ocean crossing to build something in this country with his bare hands was gone. For the first time in a very long time, Hugo Szarka felt genuinely afraid. Imogen Foley had been on her feet for 11 hours when she took the trash out. It was past midnight. The Hotel Chateauneuf's kitchen generated an astonishing amount of waste for a building that prided itself on elegance. And the back alley pickup wasn't until 6, so someone always had to drag the overfull bags out before the cold could seal the kitchen doors shut with ice. That Tuesday, it was Imogen's turn, because Imogen's turns had a way of multiplying lately, ever since she'd covered Mariette's shift 3 weeks running, and nobody seemed to have noticed it was still happening. She was 26 from Sudbury originally, though she'd been in Montreal long enough that the French came easier now. She was a big woman, solid, as her mother used to say before her mother stopped being able to say much of anything reliably, with dark auburn hair that escaped every elastic she owned, and hazel eyes that missed very little. She wore her weight the way she wore everything, without apology and without much thought. There wasn't time for either. She dragged 2 bags down the alley and was turning back for the 3rd, when her boot caught something in the snow near the base of the dumpster. She nearly went down. Her hand shot out against the brick wall, her heart lurched, and she looked down expecting a chunk of ice or a broken bottle. It was a medal on a broken chain. She picked it up, held it under the weak service light mounted above the kitchen door. It was heavy, real gold or something close to it, and it bore a design she didn't immediately recognize, an 8-pointed cross with a stylized crown at the center. On the reverse, engraved in careful script, Béla Szarka, 1944. Nefeled, Honan Jutel. She didn't read Hungarian, but she recognized the date and the name easily enough. She stood in the alley with slush soaking through her work shoes and thought about 3 things in this order. First, a pawnshop on Rue Saint-Denis would give her $4,000, maybe $5,000 for this without asking a single question, and her mother's care facility in NDG had just raised its monthly fees. Second, the name engraved on the back was not hers. Third, her father had owned a battered Hamilton wristwatch he'd worn every day since he was 20. When he died, Imogen had kept it in her coat pocket for 6 months before she could bring herself to put it in a drawer. She still hadn't sold it. She never would. She closed her fingers around the medal. "You absolute soft-hearted idiot," she told herself without much heat. She went back inside and finished her shift. By morning, she had found the name, Szarka Enterprises, a construction holding company with an address on Boulevard René Lévesque, and a website that was professionally sparse in the way that suggested the website was not the point. She read 3 things about Hugo Szarka online, that he was one of the wealthiest property developers in Quebec, that he gave heavily to a children's literacy foundation in Rosemont, and that a federal organized crime task force had investigated his holdings in 2019 and closed the file for lack of evidence. The 4th thing she read was between the lines of all 3 of the others. She took the metro downtown on her day off, still in her coat that was a size too small because she kept forgetting to replace it, and she walked into the lobby of Szarka Enterprises at 9:15 in the morning. The lobby was marble and restraint. The security desk was manned by a man built like a commercial refrigerator who looked at Imogen the way people sometimes looked at her when she took up space she hadn't been given permission to take, with the flat assumption that she was there by mistake. "I need to speak with Mr. Szarka," she said. "Mr. Szarka doesn't take walk-in appointments. I have something that belongs to him. You can leave it at the desk." Imogen looked at the desk. She looked at the man behind it. She thought about 11 years of being told to leave things at desks, to wait in lobbies, to make herself easy to process. "No," she said pleasantly. "I don't think I will." The guard reached for her arm. The elevator opened. She didn't look at first. She was focused on keeping the guard's hand from closing around her wrist. But the lobby went quiet in a way that had a texture to it, a held-breath quality that made her finally turn her head. The man who walked out with 3 others flanking him was tall, broad-shouldered, dark-haired, with the first threads of grey at his temples, and he moved the way certain men move when they have never once, in their adult lives, had to wonder whether someone would step aside for them. He was wearing a charcoal suit, and no tie, collar open, and there was something controlled and contained about the set of his expression that made Imogen think of water just before it freezes. Grey eyes found the commotion at the security desk and did not let go. "What is this?" His voice carried without effort across the lobby's marble and glass. French-accented English, low and even. The guard straightened. "Sir, this woman refuses to leave. She claims." "I have something of yours." Imogen said it over the guard's explanation, clearly, without raising her voice. "And I'd rather give it to you than to someone who might lose it again." Hugo Szarka crossed the lobby toward her. He stopped 3 feet away and looked at her. Not past her, not through her, but at her, with the full and unsettling attention of a man who had spent his entire adult life reading situations for what they actually contained. "You're not from here," he said. "Sudbury, but I live here now." She reached into her coat pocket. She felt the 3 men around Hugo shift into readiness, and she ignored it completely. She opened her palm. The medal sat in the center of it, chain coiled underneath, the gold catching the lobby light. The silence that fell over Hugo Szarka's face was not the silence of someone processing new information. It was the silence of someone absorbing a blow. His hand came up slowly. His fingers, large, calloused, with a faded scar across the left knuckle, closed around the medal as though it might dissolve. He turned it over. "Read the inscription." When he looked back up at Imogen, something had shifted in the grey of his eyes that hadn't been there 30 seconds earlier. "Where did you find it?" "The alley behind the Hotel Chateau Neuf, Tuesday night, just after midnight." A pause. "There was a scuffle of some kind. I heard it earlier in my shift. I assumed it was bar patrons." He studied her for a long moment. "You work at the Chateau Neuf?" "I'm a housekeeper." She said it the same way she said everything, without distance or defensiveness. The engraving on the back has a name and a year. It looked like something someone would miss. "Do you know who I am?" "I know your name is on the building I'm standing in." She tilted her head. "I looked you up before I came." "And you came anyway." "The medal wasn't mine to keep." She said it simply. "Someone carved a name into it for a reason. I lost my father a few years ago. I still have his old watch. I know what it feels like to hold the last physical thing you have that belonged to someone." She pulled her coat tighter. "Anyway, that's all. I hope the cold didn't damage it." She turned to leave. "Wait." His voice was quiet, but it stopped her the way a hand on the shoulder would have. She turned back. "You could have sold this," Hugo said. "A private buyer would have paid. I know what it would have brought." She held his gaze steadily. "I work double shifts 3 times a week to cover the fees for my mother's memory care on Rue Sherbrooke West. The facility raised its rates in December, so believe me, I thought about it." She lifted her chin slightly. "But it wasn't mine. And I'm not a person who takes things that aren't mine." A pause. "Good luck with whoever sent those 4 men, Mr. Szarka. I hope it works out." She pushed through the revolving door and stepped out onto Boulevard René Lévesque. The cold hit her like a wall. She was 3 steps down the sidewalk when she heard it. A low, deliberate idle that had no business being on this street at this hour, and then the sudden mechanical shriek of tires on packed snow. A black sedan that had been parked across the street lurched forward. She didn't understand what was happening until the lobby doors burst open behind her, and something very large hit her from the side, taking her completely off her feet. and the world became a collision of pavement and arms, and the sharp thunder of shots fired close together, then more from somewhere above her. Hugo Szarka had his body over hers on the concrete. She could feel the weight of him, the tension in every muscle, the way he'd angled himself between her and the street tit. Shouts in French, and the screech of the sedan disappearing into traffic. One of his men was in the street firing, another was on his phone. Hugo pushed himself up on his forearms and looked down at her. Snow and exhaust, and underneath it, something warmer, cedar and cold air. "Are you hurt?" The controlled voice had a crack in it that hadn't been there in the lobby. No, she was shaking. She hadn't been shot. Her coat was soaked through from the sidewalk. What, who? They were watching the building. His jaw was tight. He pulled her to her feet in one motion, his hand at her elbow firm and careful at once. "They saw you give me something that made my men stand down. In their world, that makes you either an asset or a liability." She stared at him. "I'm a housekeeper." Not tonight. He kept his hand on her arm and walked her back toward the black SUV that had appeared at the curb. Not anymore. The drive to Westmount took 22 minutes. Imogen counted them, because it was something to do besides panic. The SUV was warm and heavily reinforced. The windows so dark the city outside was a smear of orange streetlight and snow. Hugo sat across from her on a phone, talking low and rapid to his underboss. When he hung up, he looked at her with an expression that was less cold than she had expected, and more, simply, tired. Tired in the way of someone who had been tired for a very long time. "My mother is at Mémoire Lumière on Rue Sherbrooke West," Imogen said. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "If I don't show up for her Friday payment, they'll move her to a shared ward." Hugo leaned toward the partition. "Balint. Call Mémoire Lumière. Imogen Foley's mother is being transferred to their private care floor, tonight if possible. Secure the billing to my personal accounts. 2 men outside her room by morning." He leaned back and looked at Imogen. "She'll be looked after." Imogen opened her mouth, closed it. The gesture was so enormous and so casually delivered that she couldn't find a foothold in it. "You can't just." "I just did." A pause. Something moved in his grey eyes. "You came into my building to return something precious when you had every practical reason not to. The least I can do is ensure you don't lose what you love because of it." Imogen looked at her hands in her lap, at the worn seam of her coat where she kept meaning to patch it. "I want to be very clear," she said, "that I don't want to be here." "I know. And I reserve the right to tell you when you're being insufferable." Something crossed his face that might, in different lighting, have been the beginning of a smile. "That's a short list of people. I'll manage." The estate in Westmount sat behind an iron gate and old maple trees, the house itself a century-old stone manor that had been quietly updated with every security measure money could acquire. Imogen was given a room on the 2nd floor, overlooking a garden that was, in January, a collection of snow-covered shapes she couldn't quite identify. She was not compliant. When a personal shopper arrived the following morning with rolling racks of designer clothing, in sizes that suggested Hugo Szarka, had completely failed to look at her, she sent them away with the same pleasant, immovable firmness she used on difficult hotel guests who believed a 5-star rating meant their requests had no reasonable limit. Hugo found her that evening sitting on the edge of the bed in her own clothes, worn charcoal work trousers and a navy sweater that was pilling at the elbows, looking out at the snow in the garden with an expression that was not defeated but was very quietly exhausted. "I was told you dismissed the stylist," he said from the doorway. She brought clothes for someone else. Imogen didn't move from the window. Someone narrow. Someone who takes up as little space as possible and calls it elegant. She finally looked at him. "I am a size 22. I have been a size 22 since I was 19, and I have spent a considerable amount of energy in the intervening years learning not to apologize for it. I'm not starting now because your stylist can't be bothered to ask. She tilted her head. If you're going to keep me here, the least you can do is find a tailor who knows how to dress an actual person. Hugo crossed the room slowly. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she had to look up at him, and he looked down at her with an expression that was nothing like the ones she had learned to brace for. No pity. No, the reflexive, slight dismissal she had catalogued 1,000 times in 1,000 rooms. Something attentive and specific, and she had no other word for it, serious. I will find you a proper tailor, he said, tonight. Good. And for what it's worth. His voice dropped slightly. The woman who walked into my building this morning, who stood her ground against a security guard twice her size, who looked at a medal worth thousands of dollars and decided it wasn't hers. He stopped. That woman takes up exactly the right amount of space. Imogen's throat did something complicated. That was almost a compliment, she managed. I'm out of practice. He looked like he meant it sincerely. For 2 weeks, the Westmount estate held its breath. Hugo rearranged his schedule in ways that Ballant, who had worked beside him for 9 years, found quietly disorienting. He appeared at dinner consistently, which was unprecedented. He ordered food in quantities that suggested he intended Imogen to actually eat, and she did. Quebecois pea soup, tourtière, aged cheese from a fromagerie at the Atwater Market. They talked. He told her about Hugo Szarka, who had emigrated from Budapest in 1952 with $40 and an army cross and had built, through 30 years of construction work and stubborn reinvestment, the foundation on which Hugo had built everything else. She told him about her father's Hamilton watch, about Sudbury winters, about her mother's face on the days when the fog lifted briefly, and she was simply herself again for an hour. The ice, which had seemed structural, load-bearing, essential, began in small and specific places to give. It gave on the Thursday evening, when he found her trying to reach the highest library shelf, and, without comment, handed her the book she wanted, without making her ask twice. It gave on the Sunday morning when she told him a joke so badly timed that it shouldn't have landed, and he laughed anyway, genuinely, in a way that changed his whole face. It gave incrementally and without announcement, the way ice gives in early spring on the river, not all at once, but inevitably, once it has decided to. Then Ballant's second-in-command, a man named Coldest, took $40,000 from the Boudreau family and opened a service door. The attack came on a Wednesday night. Imogen was in the library, folded into the armchair near the fire in a deep green housecoat that Lizelle, a tailor from a shop on Rue Bernard, who Hugo had found in under 2 hours, had made for her in 2 days flat. It fit. She hadn't realized until she put it on how long it had been since clothes simply fit without negotiation. Hugo was at his desk reviewing documents, though his eyes had found their way to her approximately every 4 minutes for the past hour. The alarm system went off all at once, a single shriek cut short as the power died, dropping the room into black. Down. Hugo was around the desk before the word finished, a gun in his hand from somewhere she hadn't seen. She dropped behind the armchair without being told twice. Ballant came through the door with a flashlight and a tactical vest already on. It's the Boudreaux. Fernand didn't take the refusal well. 12 men, maybe more. Coldest opened the east gate. Hugo said something in Hungarian that she suspected was not complimentary. Panic room now. They moved through the dark manor with the flashlight cutting ahead. The house was not quiet. She could hear boots on the floors below, shouting in French, the suppressed percussion of weapons that sounded nothing like television. Imogen kept her hand on the back of Hugo's jacket. She did not trip, and she did not freeze, because there was no percentage in either. They were halfway down the grand staircase when the front doors came off their hinges. Light flooded in, men with rifles. Ballant took down the first two with the specific economy of someone who has done this before and intends to do it again. Imogen pressed herself behind the newel post, watching the dark foyer below with a clarity that comes when adrenaline removes everything except what matters. A mercenary came around the base of the stairs. His rifle tracked along the wall and found the green fabric of her housecoat. Hugo moved. He crossed 6 feet of open staircase in less than 2 seconds, putting himself between the rifle and Imogen, and the gun discharged once as he brought the man down, but once was enough. He hit the stairs and didn't get up. Hugo, she was beside him before the last echo faded. The white of his dress shirt was going dark red at the shoulder. His face was pale, but his eyes were open, focused, direct, present. "Through," he said, which she understood to mean the bullet hadn't lodged. "It went through. Don't talk." She pressed both hands against the wound the way she'd seen it done, hard and steady, the warmth of his blood immediate against her palms, and she did not flinch because flinching wouldn't help anything. "Don't you dare talk." Outside sirens, Ballant was already on the radio. The remaining attackers were retreating into the snowy grounds, disappearing between the old maples. The estate had a medical room, of course it did. The private surgeon arrived in 27 minutes. Imogen did not leave. She sat at the edge of the cot and watched the surgeon work with a focused and terrible attention, and when it was over and Hugo was stitched and medicated and awake, still grey-eyed, still present, the pain folded away behind that composure he wore like a second skin, she was still there. "You didn't leave," he said. "Where would I go?" She kept her voice level. It cost her something. "You ruined my Wednesday." He looked at her for a long time. The medication was pulling at the edges of his voice, but his eyes were clear. "Fernand Boudreau will surrender before morning," he said. "Coldest has been found." "It's over, Imogen. You're safe. You've been safe since the moment you walked into my building." A pause. "I'm sorry it didn't feel that way." She looked at his shoulder, at the bandage, at the composed, careful attention with which he was watching her, as though she were something he was still in the process of understanding. He reached into the pocket of the slacks folded on the chair beside the cot. His hand came back with the gold medal on its repaired chain. Imogen stared at it. "I had the chain repaired the morning after you returned it," he said quietly. "I intended to mention that. I forgot for a while that there were things I hadn't said." He held it across the space between them. "My grandfather wore this through a war and a revolution, and 40 years of building something in a country that didn't know him yet. He gave it to my father. My father gave it to me." He paused. "He told me to give it to someone who earned it, not someone who wanted what it represented, someone who didn't know what it represented and kept it safe anyway." Imogen's chest ached. "I have turned away every woman who came close to me," Hugo continued, his voice lower now, "because every one of them wanted the empire, the building with my name on it, the table at the restaurant that doesn't need a reservation." He turned the medal in his fingers. "You handed me this and asked for nothing. You told me I was insufferable before you knew me well enough to have a real opinion. You rejected an entire rack of designer clothes and requested a tailor. You asked for food that was actually food." He looked up at her. "I have been alone for a very long time by choice. I am choosing differently." He held the medal out further. "I'm not proposing with a ring," he said. "I'm proposing with the thing you already saved once." Imogen looked at the medal lying across his palm, at the engraved name of a man she had never known, who had survived things she couldn't imagine, and who had given his grandson this as proof that some things outlast the worst that happens to them. She picked it up, held it the way she had held it in the alley behind the hotel, in the slush and cold alone, carefully because it mattered. Then she put it around his neck herself, her fingers steady at his nape, the chain settling back where it belonged. "Yes," she said, But I'm keeping my last name too. Obviously, he said, and the smile that crossed his face then was nothing like ice. It was nothing like February. It was the specific, unguarded expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he stopped believing was possible and finds it more real than anything he built. 11 months later, the Fondation Szarka Literacy Gala filled the grand ballroom of the Hotel Ritz-Carlton in Montreal. Politicians attended. Business leaders attended. Several people attended whose presence was notable to a small and attentive subset of the city's law enforcement community. At the head table sat Hugo Szarka, as composed and grey-eyed as ever, flanked by associates who had learned in 11 months to direct their questions to his left rather than his right, because the woman on his left had opinions about the answers. Imogen Foley wore a dress of deep burgundy wool, custom-tailored by Lizelle, that fit the exact shape of her without apology or concession. Her dark auburn hair was up, with the usual escapees at her temples. Her mother, whose private floor at Mémoire Lumière had been considerably upgraded, was stable that week, one of the good weeks, and had recognized Imogen on the phone that afternoon and said, "You sound happy, ma chérie." She was. On her wrist, on a new gold chain, was the medal. Hugo had insisted. She had told him it was his grandfather's. He had told her it was theirs. On the table beside her right hand sat her father's old Hamilton watch, which she never went anywhere important without. Around the table, conversation moved. Champagne circulated. Somewhere in the ballroom, a string quartet played Schubert slightly too loud. Hugo leaned over and said something low in her ear that made her laugh. The real laugh, unedited, too large for the room. And across the table, Ballant pretended he hadn't heard it. And the woman who had found a medal in a Montreal snowbank and been too stubborn and too decent to sell it, sat at the center of an empire she had never asked for, and understood, finally, that some things find you whether you are looking for them or not.